I, Ian Humphreys, am a private civilian speaking and interviewing my guests on behalf of the UK Medical Freedom Alliance. All parties participating are protected by the Geneva Convention. What follows are our personal experiences, observations and opinions, and the information is for educational purposes only. Those participating in these podcasts are professionals but are not providing medical or legal advice to you or to the public. The responsibility for the interpretation, due diligence and use of the information from this podcast lies with you, the viewer and the listener. Do your own research and use your discernment. It's not our intention to harass, intimidate, offend, defame, convey false information, cause non-trivial psychological or physical harm, or to conspire to blackmail, to coerce, or to cause anxiety, alarm, distress to any man or woman. The information presented here is done so with peaceful and honourable intentions. Thank you. Welcome to another broadcast by the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, the UK's most recognised and respected organisation advocating for every individual's right to informed consent, bodily autonomy and medical choice. We are the UK's voice of ethical medicine. Hi, welcome along to the UK Medical Freedom Alliance. My name is Ian Humphreys and this is another UK MFA TV presentation, and I really want you to pay close attention to this one. This is our current campaign that's running right now, which is against the Assisted Dying Bill, which is due to be read for the second time in Parliament on the 29th of November. The date of recording of this particular interview is the 21st of November. And I'm going to sit back so that you can hear our CEO, Dr. Elizabeth Evans, talk to Amanda Hunter. Now, you might know Amanda from Families Against Involuntary Medical Euthanasia. She's also part of the Together campaign, and she also started Care Unlock. She has a lot of information, a lot of emotional information to input into this. And it's very, very clear why we've adopted the position that we've adopted as part of UKMFA. Please consider donating to the UKMFA. We are really grateful for all donations, no matter how small. Your donations enable us to continue to lobby for your right to informed consent and medical freedom to be upheld, and to provide resources to educate and empower the public. There are multiple options for donating. One is that you can scan the QR code that's on this video right now, or you can go to the link that is featured in the description below this video, or you can go onto our website and contribute via donor box, or you can buy us a coffee. So without further ado, let's go over to Liz and Amanda.
So I'm really happy to have you on again, Amanda. It feels like the things we discuss are always so kind of grave and actually, really big issues, because we've obviously discussed the end of life, the abusive do not resuscitate order. So it feels very heavy, doesn't it, each time? And I feel but this is such an important conversation, and I was so delighted that Together have got involved in this. I think you're their health and social care, sort of their coordinator, and I was at your excellent debate last night. I just want to say, hats off to you. It was a brilliant debate. I thought it was really balanced. I think both sides put their views really clearly and then were able to defend them and were good about answering questions on their views. So I thought that is the sort of civilized discussion we need to be having about such a fundamental change this would be to our society. And so from UKMFA's point of view, and I just want to get this disclaimer out really first, that the most important thing is that we acknowledge that those calling for assisted dying are doing so in good faith, and they genuinely are doing it from a compassionate and a desire to alleviate suffering, and from a genuine fear that people will suffer unbearable suffering at the end of their life. And I think we can agree with them on that point, that we don't want anyone to die in unbearable pain either, or face that prospect. And we do recognise that at the moment this does happen because high quality palliative care is not available to everyone. But while it's a seductive proposition on the surface, we don't believe that assisted dying will provide the answer that all of us are looking for to try to give people as dignified an end to their life as possible. So I think let's start with some of the points that came up in the debate last night. My first point would be that I'm worried that we're being sold a romanticised view of what assisted dying can be. You know, you have these celebrity endorsements, you have this idea that you could just sit in your home, you know, drink a drink, just pass away with all your family around you, no pain, no suffering. And yet when I'm sort of digging into some of the medical journals on this and actually looking at studies, the reality can be very, very different. You know, you can get vomiting, you can pass out, then come round again, there can be pain, and there is no guarantee that the death will be quick. So just, I think on a practical basis, and I know you'll have lots of other practical issues, it feels like even with the best will in the world, if you are on the side of assisted dying, I'm not convinced that this is a workable proposition, especially having read through the bill. So I don't know where you want to start, Amanda, on that.
Well, well, first of all, I want to say that, yes, I totally agree with you, and, you know, the Together Social Care team, you know, even some of us within the team are kind of divided a little bit on the issue. But we fundamentally realise and understand, because of our experiences during lockdown, what happened to our parents, but we understand that this is totally unworkable, and it's not the answer. Assisted dying is not the answer to a health system that cannot cope with the demands upon it for palliative care. We should be fighting, demanding better economic growth. We should be demanding a more dynamic economy so that we have the resources to invest in palliative care and in good medicine at end of life. And the reality is that, as you say, very few people actually get access to it. I think there are two things that we need to look at. We need to look at the fact that people are not getting the palliative care that they need. But palliative care, even when it exists, is not all it's cracked up to be. I mean, this is something that Sam himself actually recognises, you know, and says that, you know, a lot of these end-of-life protocol abuses actually go on in hospices, but people wouldn't expect that to happen. And I think the general ethos of the hospice is good, but there are, you know, bad players everywhere. And I think we've seen what happens on the end-of-life pathways, where people have been, you know, sedated, food taken away, drink taken away, they deteriorate, all the medications are withdrawn, and the end is a very long and horrific death. And even when the drugs come in, it could be days before the person passes away, you know, and often in terrible suffering at the end.
Yeah, and I was really struck by the fact that one of the arguments of the people in favour, one of Sam's arguments, the doctor in palliative care, was that, well, end-of-life protocols and DNARs are being imposed without informed consent, and people are dying, you know, without having consented. So because it's so broken with the end-of-life care, therefore we should bring in assisted dying. But I'm thinking, if you can't trust the system to implement humanely what we've already got, we can't have this.
Well, absolutely. And I have huge respect for Sam. All his work in exposing, you know, the ongoing Liverpool care pathway, because the practices are identical and it's happening now. They were ramped up during COVID, and those precedents have been set. And to know that and yet still advocate for assisted dying, I think, you know, he's a man with a good soul. He, as you said, these people have come from a point of compassion, but I think they are naive. And I think in some cases, and they're not looking at the economic, political and cultural context in which this will be exercised. And because of what we know, the families in Families Against Involuntary Medical Euthanasia and the Together Social Care team, because of our experience, because of what we know is already going on, we are frightened, we are really concerned about the impact this would have, because we know that coercion already goes on. You can write in what you like to the bill, and the legal, the safeguards around, non-coercion, and people, if people are found to have coerced someone, then they will be prosecuted. And, oh, good luck on that one. We know families who have, DNRs imposed without their consent. Of course, families, they don't have to have the consent, and this is the problem with DNARs, is that the doctor does not need the family's consent. They have to consult the family. I mean, that should not be, as it 9 times out of 10 is a consultation of a fact that has already been decided. So if it's been decided that somebody is not for further treatment, then, that is decided, and the family can be told about it afterwards. So I think there's a real problem with DNARs, and Sam is right, and they are being abused.
Sorry, can we just explain who Sam is? Because for those of us that weren't on the meeting last night, and obviously those people that are watching here, they won't know who Sam is. So perhaps we could put him into context with this conversation.
Yes, well, Sam Ahmadzai is an ex-senior consultant within the NHS, a palliative care consultant. He's now retired, a professor, and he works a lot on end-of-life cases, giving evidence when there have been wrongs. And he also is the co-author of When End-of-Life Care Goes Wrong. He co-authored that with James Bogle, a barrister, and they looked at they looked at hundreds of cases actually. They chose 18 to focus on. And they revealed that far from, even though the Liverpool Care Pathway had been officially banned in 2014, it was still very much in practice. And this was really before, a lot of those cases were before COVID, and we know families involved on the campaign side, and there's my group, but there are other groups, and we know that it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. We are, there must be about 160 of us families who have been directly impacted by end-of-life protocols. And we know that during the pandemic, because most of us suffered this, or our loved ones suffered this during the pandemic, we know that these practices were ramped up during the period. And I think that, there was an exercise that was called Nimbus. I'm going to digress here a little bit, but I think it's important. There was an exercise called Nimbus that the government claims that was never actually put into practice. Now, that exercise Nimbus was basically, one of the aspects of it was doctors were asking ministers whether they could prioritise care. And there was a debate about it, and it had, obviously they were concerned that the public would be outraged by this. And so they denied it ever happened. But for families who were impacted, it would seem that it's very much Operation Nimbus or Exercise Nimbus, whatever it was called, was in practice. All the the indicators of blanket DNARs on the people of over 65. If you had a respiratory condition, whether it was COVID or not, you were put on end of life, as my mother was.
It's a clear example, though, of how a slippery slope happens, isn't it? That wasn't when DNARs first came in. Certainly, when I was practicing, all it meant was don't jump up and down on their chest if their heart stops.
Yeah, I mean, Steve James, I'm sorry, is totally naive. I mean, Steve James came on last night and contributed in a neutral position.
So he's a critical care consultant who spoke to, was it Sajid Javid during the, or Boris Johnson, one or the other, about the NHS mandates, just to set the context. Yeah, so he came on as a neutral.
Yes, but he seems to be either disingenuous or naive, to be frank. Because DNARs, as our families know, do not mean do not resuscitate anymore. or rather they mean a lot more than that. They are a shorthand for do not attempt recovery. So do not treat, withdraw medications, withdraw food and fluids after you've sedated them, because obviously if somebody's had their medications withdrawn, they are going to be suffering, they are going to be agitated, and therefore, because they are agitated, they are given midazolam or other sedatives, and then they deteriorate. They can't communicate, they can't eat and drink independently. Then they can say, oh, well, they can't eat and drink independently, and, you know, clinically assisted nutrition and hydration is a treatment. We can withdraw that. And so they withdraw it. And so the person is basically put on an end-of-life pathway. And the hospitals will swear blind that this is not the case. You know, so many of our families have been told, no, your loved one wasn't put on an end-of-life pathway. Well, if they weren't, why was it they were told your loved one will die in 2 days? Because you cannot say with such a degree of certainty that somebody's going to die in 2 days unless you are orchestrating that death in some way. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So by implementing and legalising assisted dying, you are effectively taking away the last taboo, aren't you? That
Yes.
it's acceptable to take a life.
Yes.
And it's a valid treatment for suffering. And I think what's really curious is currently, and what I really was a bit upset about, is there was no discussion of morals or ethics in the debate from either side, really. I know you were doing, but particularly the doctors in favour of assisted dying didn't mention it. You know, just because we can do it, just because it might work, is it the right thing to do? It's the morality side, the ethical side, the human side, the Hippocratic side. And you know, say if we saw someone about to throw themselves off a bridge, you know, now, I think everybody that you don't say, well, he obviously wants to commit suicide. Well, you know, who am I to stop him? He doesn't want to, you know, for whatever reason, he's decided to end his life. I should just let him do whatever he should do. No, we have a moral urge to go to rescue that person, to try to talk them round, to try to get them help. You know, the same if you find someone on the floor who's swallowed loads of tablets and is unconscious, you don't say, well, you know, who am I to interfere with this? They've obviously made, you know, an informed decision. That's what they've done. It's not for me to stop them. So I think that the autonomy argument, if you take it to an extreme, which means that people can literally do what they want and we will never step in, actually denies the humanity where we do instinctively step in when somebody is trying to destroy.
Yes, I mean, it's the human impulse, isn't it? It's the human impulse to save life and to you know, to and not want to see any suffering. And I think that it's also very disingenuous, some of the arguments, because I mean, Jackie Davis, who is on the board of directors of Dignity in Dying, and also chairs the I've forgotten the healthcare professionals for assisted dying. Yes, and I thought she was very disingenuous because she was focusing on the very small percentage of people who die in pain. You know, the fact is, there was another palliative care doctor who's come out recently and has been talking about this at some length. And he says, you know, in all his career, there have only been a couple of cases where they have not been able to control the pain. And Sam last night said that, you know, there are instances when they can't control the pain and the only way to do that is through sedation. But the thing is, we cannot make a law for millions of citizens on the premise that a few people are going to die in, you know, in pain and lacking dignity at the end of life. To be honest, all the people whose loved ones died on end-of-life pathways were given no dignity at the end of life. In fact, if you should see the photos of people in hospital and care homes, their dignity was thrown out the window. And so I just do not buy that argument. And so, yes, very few people actually die in great pain. And if you look at the reasons for MAID, for example, and Jackie Davis kept saying, oh, well, let's not look at Canada, let's just look at Oregon. But it's the same thing. You know, the reason people give for wanting assisted suicide, the main reason is burden. The sense that they are a burden on their families or a burden on the health service, a burden on resources. That's their reason, not pain. You know, and we've seen many cases where, you know, people who are terminal, who had said that they wanted to die early, in the end they wanted to fight on, and they wanted to live those last weeks and months of their lives, and, you know, despite the pain, because they had their loved ones around them and they wanted to spend those last moments with them. So I really don't buy those arguments. And she was also disingenuous, I think, on many issues. On the suicide, you know, suicide rates, all these people committing suicide and, you know, doing it on their own. The main reason for suicide is not pain, it's not terminal illness, it is depression and distress, you know. I mean, that might come from having a terminal illness. I mean, I've had cancer myself, my brother too. You know, it can have a huge toll on your psyche. But, you know, the real reason for people wanting to end their lives is depression and anxiety and trauma, not pain, which, as I said, is largely controlled within the NHS. And, you know, we, you know, as families whose loved ones were effectively euthanized on end-of-life care pathways, they kept telling us that our families needed pain control, pain control, pain control. It was always there. The morphine was always there. Quite interestingly, I had a conversation with my hairdresser, as you do, and he was telling me about his mother, who had terminal cancer and was being cared for at home. The GP gave them the morphine and said, use it as necessary. I think that's a bit problematic, but at the same time, you can see that we don't really need a law for this.
No, and I think, you know, going back to palliative care, it seems obvious to me that the minute you allow assisted dying, you have removed the incentive to do better research into palliative care, to widen it, to fund it, because it is inevitably more expensive, more resource intensive to look after someone, you know, to give them the psychological support, because psychological support is hugely important part of palliative care. It's not just about drugs and symptom relief, it's spiritual support, you know, people praying with, you know, their faith leaders, you know, working through having difficult conversations and sort of closure conversations with relatives. And
absolutely,
we really undervalue the benefit to everybody in that of coming to a place of peace, having struggled through, you know, coming to terms with something that's going to come to us all, you know. And I think in a way what assisted dying is trying to do is solve the problem of death. You know, if we can just make this really clinical, really quick, then we no longer need to fear death. But the fact is, you know, I don't think science is going to solve the problem of death. It is always going to be a struggle. It's always going to be a great grief, and it's, you know, and it's final. But it's also where we can find our humanity, where we can teach our loved ones lessons, where they can dig deep and be compassionate and caring and slow their own lives down. I think, you know, there are so many things we would lose if we just want to what sort of society do we want to create? Just a very utilitarian society where, you know, once you're not of value anymore, then, you know, you might as well just end it, because what's the point?
Yes, I mean, I totally agree, and it's an argument I make often. You know, there's a very thin line between utilitarian bean counting and eugenics. And as you say, it costs a lot more to invest in somebody's good palliative care than it will to, assist them to their death. But we should be investing in assisting people to live, not assisting people to die.
Yeah.
And this will become a fix solution, a quick fix solution, a final solution for people who require social care and are waiting on, lists of thousands, more than thousands, hundreds of thousands, waiting on lists to get the care they need. And we already know in other countries where this has been introduced, people have been told because they needed a wheelchair ramp that they were offered assisted dying. Somebody who had to wait for their chemotherapy was offered assisted dying. Somebody who was depressed and homeless was offered assisted dying. It will become one of the things on the menu. Mm-hmm. So you've got 12 months on the waiting list. Yes, we know it's going to be painful, but there's this option. You could sort of end it today, or I just think it's a very, very dangerous road to go on. And people talk about the slippery slope, and I want to talk about the economic and cultural and political context apart from the slippery slope. But I would say that the slippery slope arguments ignore the fact that we are different countries, okay? So the pro-assisted dying people will say, oh, well, we're not Canada, we're not Netherlands, and we'll do things differently, and that's really for the birds. But at the same time, yes, we are different, and we have different contexts, and we need to look at those contexts to understand whether this is the right decision to make. And I would say it isn't. But, for the slippery slope argument, I say we're already on it. We started along the slippery slope with the livable care pathway. It was banned, it didn't go away, stayed under the radar, continued, ramped up, as I said, during lockdown. Those precedents set. We are already on the slippery slope, and if we go down the assisted dying route, we will slide down into the abyss, I think. The future for society. I was talking on Twitter, having a conversation on Twitter this morning, and somebody was talking about, the psychological impact this will have on us as a society. And it's a very, very good point, because we will be the ones who are left. And I make the comparison with people whose loved ones were killed on end-of-life pathways, which is a terrible grief, because it's one thing to lose somebody through old age or natural causes. It's quite another when somebody else entrusted with their care has actively helped them, assisted them to death when they didn't want to die. They are very different kind of grief.
Find out more about the UK Medical Freedom Alliance on our website. That's at ukmedfreedom.org. That's ukmedfreedom.org, where you'll find all the information you need around open letters, our campaigns, our legal template letters, and of course, even these podcasts. You'll find details of the latest one, and you'll be able to access the previous ones too via the links there. Find out more about our team. Sign up for our newsletter. It's all there, and you can even donate too.
Yeah, no, and I was just thinking about that, the whole thing about medical ethics, which obviously we campaign on, and I raised this last night, and it was slightly poo-pooed by Jackie Davis. But the Hippocratic Oath is well recognised as the beginning of medical ethics, where they recognise that you are in an incredibly powerful and privileged position as a doctor. You have potentially the power over life and death. You've got a patient who is vulnerable because of their illness, their lack of knowledge compared to you, and they're relying on you to help them. And one of the things it says in the Hippocratic Oath is, I will not give a lethal drug to anyone if I'm asked, nor will I advise such a plan. It recognised that there was so much potential for serious damage if you allowed that at all. So I've often talked, in many areas of medical ethics about having to have red lines. There are just lines you don't go over. Not because, if you did allow assisted dying, I do accept that for a few people, they would get the death, the very, lovely, painless death that they wish. But at what cost to the rest of society? And I think the catastrophic fallout would just, you know, be like a tsunami compared
Yeah, well, I used the same words, I think, this morning. You know, yes. And I think that we look at the impact of lockdown, the fallout of lockdown, the fallout of the visiting restrictions, the suffering that was caused to those in care homes and hospitals who were incarcerated, couldn't see their families, died of isolation and also medical neglect as well as care neglect. You know, the suffering caused to the families as well has had a tsunamic, if you could call it that, impact on mental health. I mean, you know, our services are, you know, crumbling under the pressure put upon them by the impact of lockdown harms. And if we think that was bad, I dread to think what will happen if we introduce assisted dying, because those families, and that's where I lost my thread before, whose loved ones were killed on end-of-life pathways, they are racked with guilt and regret because they didn't do enough. They are traumatised. I feel that some of them will never ever be the same again. It's really impacted their psyche, everything about them. They cannot move on. It's you know, and I feel that if we go
I was going to say it's an awesome power to take over life and death, and I think we humans do it at our peril to play God. And I know it was again another argument from Jackie Davis was we shouldn't even listen to faith-based arguments because they're just, it's obviously, you know, she didn't say nonsense, but it was like, you know, that's not rational. But actually there is such wisdom in seeing the bigger picture beyond just ourselves, and sort of, you know, there is a lot of wisdom that comes out of faith. And one of them is that, you know, if we don't you know, submit to a higher power or acknowledge one where there are some absolute kind of moral laws, then we will play God ourselves. And we know from history how terrible it is when human beings put themselves as God. And one of those ways you can do that is to put yourself as having power over life and death. And I think it is just an act of absolute hubris and folly, frankly.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree with you totally on the red line. You know, because, and I want to mention the Liverpool Care Pathway again, because this is really important, because once you cross that Rubicon, and basically there was this, LCP was basically assisted dying, you know, in effect. And once you cross that Rubicon, doesn't matter what law is changed later, that is becomes embedded in the culture.
Yeah.
And I think we're already moving towards a society that views the elderly and the frail as a burden and want to be eliminated.
Disposed of. Yeah.
Disposed of.
Yeah, so we've lost the intrinsic value of human life. The fact is that life should be, you know, revered and preserved and cared for and honoured. You know, whether somebody is in the peak of their life, you know, their physical prime, or whether they are, you know, at either end of life, vulnerable, disabled, relying on others, you know, at the end of, we're all going to die. So in a sense, we're all dying from the moment we're born. Why is it significant if it's only 3 or 4 months? I still, you know, you can still do it, you know, get a lot out of 3 or 4 months, you know, whatever state you're in.
Well, yes, but I also think that, you know, the whole 6 months thing is a
fallacy.
Fallacy, because, you know, we know that. I mean, you know, people like Sam himself will say, you know, as a palliative care consultant of many, many years, I think 40 years, if he finds it difficult to determine when somebody's going to die, when he, you know, and he specialises in cancer, as he said, that most palliative care is for people in the last months of life from a terminal illness, mostly cancer. You know, if he cannot determine when somebody's going to die, how can the rest of those who are not so expert make those prognoses?
I read in the newspaper this morning that there's actually now been a study done which looked at the effect of legalising assisted dying in the countries where they have compared to the countries where they hadn't, and looking at palliative care standards. And I think it was looking over about a 5-year period. And in the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg, they had a 5% decrease in standards of palliative care, which compared to a 25% improvement in palliative care standards in non-assisted dying countries in Europe. So I think, it's obviously going to actually diminish care. I think in the end, it diminishes care for all, because those of us who don't want to have assisted dying are going to have even less access to good palliative care, to hospices. Hospices, it's interesting, they're all funded or primarily funded now by charities. And actually, if the government are really serious about giving people a dignified, comfortable death, surely we should be, throwing funding into that, and getting and also widening the people who get it. I was quite shocked by Sam's point that actually it's only really offered to cancer patients and only in the last few weeks of their life or days. So it feels like this needs to be we need to be having this adult conversation in society and saying, right, we want our elderly, our vulnerable, our sick to have a comfortable end. And we need to invest in that. We need the government to, they don't necessarily need to be in hospitals. Lovely hospices with, good psychological, spiritual support, counsellors, beautiful rooms where their families can be. Isn't that what we all want? And I've seen deaths in hospices, and they can be really, however sad the situation, can be really positive and actually quite life enhancing for those left behind. And I think, because life is not just about an absence or existence of suffering. Like, there's more to life than that. And actually, in inspiring people, by witnessing death to realise the value of life, that can be a positive for relatives, to actually just embrace all that life has. We've sought to to clinicalise all these things in life which are a struggle. Birth now, we're getting more and more and more cesareans to try to just make it easy. You don't need to worry, you don't need to be in pain, you don't need to struggle. I've had 3 home births with no pain relief, and they were hard work, but I can tell you they were, to me, the equivalent of achieving running a marathon. Like, I came out feeling empowered, and this is something, I've seen what my body can do. Yes, it hurt, but it was incredible. And so I think we've got to look beyond just the rational and the very kind of reductionist view of life, which I think we're being sold here.
Well, absolutely. That is what we should be investing in. But the thing is, this costs money. We have an NHS that is totally broken, that is rationing care, that is denying care to the over 65s if they are frail and have comorbidities, and they end up in hospital. In many instances, I'm not saying all, of course not, but in many instances, people have DNRs put on them, and the pathway is commenced. And, that is the reality. But that is not to say that, what we should be doing, yes, we should be investing in it. But we obviously, as I said before, we need a far more dynamic economy in order to make that possible. And that's not going to happen if we, sacrifice our wealth and health of the nation at the altar of net zero. I think these are things that we really have to consider. And you might think I'm digressing here, but it's very important. If we want to have a dynamic economy that's going to be able to look after the needs, the health and social care needs of our, burgeoning elderly population, we need to have a far more dynamic economy. And I totally agree with you with the spiritual side. My mother died at home. It was awful. She was neglected by the medical profession. They refused to come out. But she died at home with her family around her. And that is what we should be investing in. As you said, it doesn't even have to be hospice. It can be care at home. It can be hospice at home, if you like, with support services around to aid that, both practically and and psychologically. Because, as you said before, it's not just the impact on the person themselves; it's their whole family around them. And I think it's just such a dangerous path. And I think if we cross this Rubicon, that will be it. I really fear for the future, because you're absolutely right about palliative care. And this is something that Jackie Davis was totally disingenuous about, and lying, quite frankly. I mean, now we have this report, but she was making out that in every country where it had been introduced, palliative services were better. Really? No. This is, and that's what I was going to say before, is that, as Kevin, you were saying, palliative care costs money. And it costs thousands compared for every week of palliative care. 1 week of palliative care would be the cost of ending somebody's life. So you can see where the utilitarian argument is coming from this, and the pressure from this, and and dignity in dying. We're have been very dismissive of faith arguments, but also they did a terrible hit piece in the Guardian over the weekend, basically saying that all these groups, Better Way, Care Not Killing, Duty of Care, all these groups, somehow that then it's no. Why should we listen to them? They're all in the pockets of evangelical organisations that are against assisted dying. I mean, that's a fallacy. That's not true. But even if it were, so what? People who have faith also have the right to express their moral convictions.
Yep. And also, I thought Kevin Yule, who's the humanist against assisted dying, shows very clearly that actually it's not just a religious argument, it's not just a Christian or Muslim argument that
it's a moral. It's a moral argument.
Secular people can have a moral framework for decision making and wisdom, and about what's the right way. And I was just looking at all the people who are now pushing back against this, against really the practicalities of it. A lot of people are saying this can't work. So there's the former chief coroner, who says that the safeguards put into the bill, so because it wasn't clear how many people had actually read the bill in this debate last night, they just open the door to involuntary euthanasia, he says, which I think is absolutely right. That's the sort of point you're making. Sir James Mumby, who's a retired High Court judge, says there's a complete lack of safeguards. You can't afford to have any secrecy in this process because that would be dangerous. But then how, who wants all their medical details put out in the public domain in a court? He says there are loads of unanswered questions, and why are judges involved? And I was thinking about the practicalities of this. Okay, so you decide you want to go for assisted dying. Well, it takes weeks to get a GP appointment. Like, how are you going to get your GP appointment? That's going to have to be at least an hour long to do the subject justice, isn't it? Then they've got to go and the doctor is then...
Well, that just won't happen, will it?
No, the doctor is meant to investigate whether you're being coerced, so surely that requires a home visit and a discussion with family. Then they have to find another doctor, so you've got your second doctor. Then you have to get a case in the High Court in front of a judge. Like, how much time and money is this process going to take? And I don't think, if you even had 1,000 people in the first week applying, I mean, that could take a year to hear all those cases. So how is this going to work unless it's just going to be rubber stamping? There is no way. It will be
rubber stamping, and I think that is exactly what the person in the audience, somebody called Peter, who spoke up and said, why is this even being put into the bill anyway? The judges, involvement, because at the end of the day, what do judges do these days? They rubber stamp what the professionals have told them, and it will be a rubber stamping exercise. I'm absolutely convinced of that, and I wanted to come back. In fact, I raised my hand at the end, but it was the end, and I knew I couldn't say anything more because I wanted to come back to Jackie Davis, because she was applauding the fact that this level of safeguard, the court's involvement, was wonderful, and watertight, and it just, looking at reality of the court system, it's for the birds. And I wanted to come back on Mumby because yes, I mean he also said, in addition to saying that it was full of the loopholes and very inadequate safeguards, he also said this is not the role of judges. This is not what judges should be there for. They should not be making decisions about who is eligible to kill themselves, to have assistance in killing themselves. That is not their role, and they should not be involved. And I totally agree. And other judges have come out since saying the same thing. So the judges don't want it. And I think the public, if they actually really understood the cultural, economic and political context in which it would be exercised, wouldn't either. And again, I would, disagree with Jackie Davis, who said, 78%, 70 to 80% of the public are on board with this. They're only on board with it because they think that end-of-life assisted dying is basically palliative care. And that once they are, confronted with the reality, once the issue of burden is suggested to them, support for assisted dying ebbs away. And I think that this is it. We are looking at this, and I blame the media. The media have not served us well on this because they are focusing on the emotive pull on the heartstrings stuff, and they're not looking at the practical consequences, which we have discussed some of today. But I just want to summarise. We have an NHS that is broken. We have a social care system that is broken. The answer is to invest in those services. It is not to invest in assisted dying. But given those contexts, given the context of an ageist society, we have an ageing population. We are looking at the elderly as a burden on resources. And this is really dangerous. I do not want to live in a society that is saying to somebody over 65, well, you've had your innings, yes, you've paid into the system all your life, but we're not going to give you any treatment now because, your quality of life isn't going to be great. It's for the person in concerned to decide whether they want to take on that burden of the lesser quality of life. It is not for the state to decide, and I think we go down a very, very dangerous path if we hand effectively the power to the state through the NHS of deciding who is eligible for assisted dying. I think it's a very, very dangerous road to go down. And I think we've seen, through COVID, the diminution of our liberties and freedoms. And if we think, and people will come back to you and they will say, oh, well, yes, but this is a decision that the individual is taking. Well, yes and no. That a lot of the time, as Kevin Newell rightly said, it's not just about coercion, maybe from families wanting the inheritance. And I think that we have far more to fear from the state than we do from our own families. But there are families like that. We do have to acknowledge that.
I was going to briefly interject to say, I think that's a really good summary. And actually, you can see a situation where the only people who could get access to good quality end-of-life palliative care are the rich. So this would turn into a sort of a privilege, you could only access if you're wealthy, to not have to be put down by the state, and that sounds really extreme and catastrophizing, but actually, is that not where this will end up?
Well, I absolutely think that's where it's end up. I mean, I think we only need to look at health and social care to understand that that's exactly where it will end up, because these days, in order to get good health care, in order to get good social care, you have to pay for it privately, and even that's no guarantee, because unless you can afford the really, really high-end social care and or get somebody in to look after your loved ones at home, which is obviously the best place for people at home, this costs thousands and thousands and thousands. And the CHC, continuing healthcare under the NHS, is the NHS's best kept secret. Most people don't know it's available, and it's extremely difficult to get, and there are so many barriers that it shouldn't be. We should be investing in continuing healthcare, and as I said, bringing that care back into the community, into people's homes to support them at the end of life. And, you know, as we've said throughout this discussion, 6 months is a fallacy. You know, my brother was told 5 years ago he had 1 year to live. He's still here and living relatively well. They get it wrong. And I really fear for the people who will be coerced into accepting assisted dying because they think their death is imminent and they're scared of the pain and the, you know, which may not materialise. And I think there is so much room for coercion. If we look at the DNARs already, how they're being used to coerce people, and we also know that doctors have falsified, we have evidence at Together Social Care of doctors falsifying the evidence, falsifying DNR signatures on DNARs, saying that conversations happened with families that never happened. And, you know, they decided, the famous two doctors, they decided and made the decision, and that was it. And the family had no involvement and no say. And I'm very fearful. You got people in hospital, elderly people, frail in other ways, and, you know, 3 visits a day to their bedside to encourage them to sign a DNA. Why? DNAR, sorry. Why?
Yeah, because not everyone has the supportive family around them.
No,
So
and you need advocates. You need advocates. You need very strong advocates, both within health system and social care. And, you know, I encourage everyone listening to go and get a lasting power of attorney immediately. Get one for yourself, get one for all the members of your family, because without it, the state will decide for you and your family. And you need to have some control. Now, ultimately, the state will decide that's wrong. I think it's another thing we need to revisit. We need to revisit DNARs, we need to revisit lasting power of attorneys and what rights they have. All these things need to be addressed. But in the meantime, that is our only chance of holding on to any control of our families and our destiny. And I really encourage people to get one of those. And I also encourage people to not sign DNARs, because when it comes to it, the NHS will decide anyway, regardless of what you feel, whether or not it's right to resuscitate someone. And 9 times out of 10, it's a no. So I think that, you know, having a DNAR in place is basically giving them license to withdraw treatment, potentially. And I think in some cases very much that has happened. And so I think, you know, do not have a DNAR. It can always be put in place, you know, when the time comes. But don't have one on your records now.
Definitely. That's all amazing advice, Amanda, and thank you so much for joining us today. I think you've really sort of summarised and just shown us how complex an issue this is. And I know you made the point last night, what are we doing? Trying to get this done in 3 or 4 weeks, you know, and trying to steamroller this through without a proper debate. And I know Together are calling for a referendum, saying that this is so serious and such a fundamental change to the relationship between the state and an individual and between a doctor and a patient.
Exactly.
This can't be rushed through.
It cannot be rushed through, and we cannot leave it to the fairly ill-informed political class. And can I just say that I wrote to my own MP, Ian Solomon, Liberal Democrat, who wrote back to me a cut and pasted reply, basically saying he was in support, he was going to vote for it. He did not address one of the concerns that I raised and I've talked about here. I went into great detail about what those concerns were. He did not respond to one of them. He blindly took it and just rabbited and parroted that the safeguards are strong, the safeguards are strong. Well, you can say it as many times as you like, it's not going to make them strong. No. They are not strong. And the whole bill requires far more scrutiny. There are many sections of that bill, and I'd like to have talked about those in more detail. Maybe we can have another session in the future looking at each of those parts of the bill and why they are problematic. But
there's a lot of unknowns in there, aren't there? There's a lot of delegated powers and the possibility to bring in secondary legislation. So it's not as tight as they're.
No, the potential for abuse is huge, and we already know what's going on now without this. So yes, we need to discuss this as a nation. We cannot leave this to the fairly ill-informed political class. I mean, Derbyshire a week ago had, I can't remember her name, it just escaped me, but the politician who was actually for the bill, can't remember her name, sorry, but she was asked 4 times, how can you be sure that there will not be coercion? She could not answer the question.
Yeah, no, this is your language is very much my language. This is a Rubicon, and there is no going back. So we would be wise to tread very slowly on this, because it's just too enormous to be rushing through and hoping for the best. And we've had arguments. Well, we can deal with the safeguards after later. No, that's not the way to do this. This is really serious. This is a matter of life and death. There's no emergency situation for this, and I think people actually would be wise to be thinking, if assisted dying had been in place during COVID, what would have happened? Would that have been abused in that situation where we were in an emergency and people were locked down, people in care homes locked away? I wonder what would have happened. I wonder if we suddenly would have seen a bit of a blanket, we don't really have the funds, if everyone's rushing into hospital and, we can't, so
well, I think that already happened. I think that already happened. We didn't have the law, but that in effect was what was happening. People were being prioritised for care, and people were being withdrawn care if it was deemed that, that it was going to be too costly and too resource heavy to actually treat them. And so they were left to die.
So we need to be realistic. We need to, see this in the real world, not in some ideological fantasy.
Yes. Yeah, I think people are looking at this from some sort of philosophical abstract. We need to look at the concrete, and the concrete here in the UK. Yes, we need to take lessons from the rest of the world where this has been introduced, but we really need to look at what's going on in our own country, the context in which it would be exercised, and I can't repeat this more, enough. We really need to get down to those issues
rather than opening more cans of worms.
Yes, absolutely, and it really will have a fundamental, seismic, paradigm shift in the relationship between us and the state. As I said, and I know I'm repeating myself, but we must not give that power to the state to decide our destiny. We must, as a nation, we must debate this, and we must have a more honest media who's actually prepared to take on people like myself and other people from the other side, and give us the time to talk to the public about our fears, because we are not being heard. You get a lot of people that are being represented from Dignity in Dying, and occasionally a couple of disability groups. But really, we need people like us being able to have the opportunity to go on, mainstream TV and talk about this. I mean, somebody said to me last night, somebody who is a Together member, she said, "Oh, this debate needs to be on mainstream television." Well, good luck on that one, But I think it was a really good step, because this is the first public debate we have had about this. I saw the views last night after a couple of hours, 718 views.
That's good.
Which is good. I mean, it's not as many as our previous one on excess deaths, but we had some really big names there. So I think this is an issue that has captured the country, and I think we need to really, really reflect as a nation on the potential consequences of this. Yeah,
definitely. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Amanda. And I think we should meet up again after the second reading. Let's keep on top of this and keep the commentary going on where we're at, because I think.
Can I just say one more thing? Sorry. Can I also say that we will be outside Parliament? That's Families Against Involuntary Medical Euthanasia, Together Social Care. Eileen Chubb from Compassion in Care will be there with people as well. We will be opposing, obviously, the bill, and we invite everybody who's listening, and bring your friends along. Come to Parliament on the 29th. We'll be there, and let's make a noise about this.
Yeah, it's 9 till 12, isn't it? I'm going to be there. So waving the UK MFA banner. I think there's going to be a lot of groups there. So yeah, definitely.
It would be a great opportunity to bring us together as well, and I think that's one of the reasons that I proposed the referendum together, is because even if the referendum is refused, the very act of putting that as a possibility on the table will help bring us together as groups opposing. And I think at the moment we're working far too much in our silos, and we need to come together. We need to be amplifying each other's messages and working in solidarity together.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you for hosting in.